For decades, we assumed the truth would arrive clearly, loudly, impossible to ignore. But what if we misunderstood the way mysteries reveal themselves? Because the deeper we look, the less certain reality becomes. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. This is the other side of normal. Hiya guys, welcome back. Here we are again. So, if you've listened to part 1 and 2, then by now something has probably started happening in the back of your mind. Not belief, not certainty, something far more uncomfortable than that. Doubt. Not doubting what you think is happening, but doubting how confidently we can explain what isn't. Yeah? Due to me dropping my phone and, shall we say, compromising the camera, we've gone back old school. It's audio, which I'm fine with. The feedback from the other shows pretty much non-existent, if I'm honest. I mean, my mate down the road said, we listened to your podcast, me and my wife, when we were going to sleep. And, yeah, he didn't say it was good or anything. He just said that. I was going to ask, but I didn't want the embarrassment. Right, anyway, grab yourself a cuppa. I got my can, Coke. So, doubt. Not doubting what you think is happening, but doubting how confidently we can explain what isn't, as I said. Because so far, we've walked through documented military encounters, congressional testimony, pilot reports, mass sightings, radar confirmations, official investigations, and one repeated truth that seems to follow this subject wherever it bloody goes. Something is being observed, something real, something tracked, something acknowledged, and yet still not fully understood. The 2004 Nimitz encounter gave us one of the most incredible military cases on record today. Experienced pilots, radar confirmation, a craft or phenomenon, depending on how carefully you want to speak, that behaved in ways that challenged conventional understanding. And then onto the Phoenix Lights, reminded us that mass sightings are not always easily dismissed, particularly when the same descriptions emerge from thousands of witnesses separated by geography, but united by the same event. Congressional testimony brought something else into focus, that these encounters may not be rare. Former Navy pilot Ryan Graves testified under oath in 2023. It feels like I was just round the corner, doesn't it? 2023, like 3 years ago. That military pilots were encountering unidentified objects repeatedly. Not occasionally, but repeatedly. In his own words, these sightings are just routine. Routine. Now that matters, because routine changes the emotional shape of the discussion. A mystery that happens once becomes folklore. A mystery that happens repeatedly becomes a problem. And if you strip everything else away from this topic, the theories, the arguments, The internet noise, that is where we currently stand. Not at the answers, just at a problem. Something is happening often enough that military agencies changed the terminology. Often enough that reporting systems were formalised. Often enough that congressional hearings happened. And often enough that trained observers stopped quietly dismissing what they were seeing. But before we go further, we need to confront something uncomfortable. Because right now, we have more evidence than ever before. I mean, loads and loads has been dropped this week alone. And apparently there's still going to be dropping stuff in the future. I mean, some of that footage is nuts that came out this week. Anyway, that's a story for another time. So we've got more evidence than ever before, as I said, and less ability to trust it. Now that sounds contradictory, but it really isn't, because we live in a completely different world than we did even 10 years ago. Christ, even 6 years ago. It's since COVID, it's just completely different. Think about what visual proof used to mean. A photograph carried weight. A video created legitimacy. If somebody showed footage of something unexplained, you started from the assumption that what you were seeing was probably real. Manipulated perhaps, misunderstood maybe, but fundamentally connected to reality. That assumption no longer exists, because now reality itself can be manufactured. Artificial intelligence has changed something fundamental about trust. Images can be generated in seconds. Videos can be fabricated, voices cloned, entire moments created that never happened. And that creates a larger problem than UFOs, because it changes the way humans interact with evidence itself. We are entering a world where seeing something no longer means believing it. And strangely, that might be one of the biggest reasons this subject feels more confusing than ever before. Because while military agencies quietly release verified footage, millions of people are simultaneously consuming fake videos generated for clicks. Objects appearing over cities, alien invasions, impossible sightings, perfectly rendered, emotionally convincing, completely false. And when fake material becomes overwhelming, something dangerous starts to happen. The real cases disappear into the noise. Nothing feels urgent, nothing feels meaningful, nothing feels worth paying attention to. That creates, it's like a kind of psychological paralysis, where certainty collapses under volume, and maybe that's already happening. Because think about this honestly. If a genuinely extraordinary event happened tomorrow, would people believe it, or would they scroll past it? Assume it was AI, laugh, move on. Because we've become conditioned to distrust our own eyes now. And there's something deeply unsettling about that, because for decades the criticism surrounding UFOs was simple. Where's the evidence? Now the problem is almost reversed. There's too much of it. Too much footage, too many claims, too much noise. And buried somewhere inside all of that could be something genuine, something important, something misunderstood. And we may not even recognise it. Because once trust collapses, reality becomes harder to hold on to. This is one of those reasons official investigations place so much emphasis on multi-sensor confirmation, radar, infrared targeting, visual observation, telemetry, because unlike a blurry internet video, those systems are harder to manipulate, harder to fake, harder to dismiss, and yet even there, the uncertainty still remains, because despite years and years of investigation, despite years of reports, years of hearings, years of testimony, we still arrive at the same sentence. We do not know. And if that frustrates you, you're not alone. Humans hate uncertainty, psychologically speaking. We are built to close the gaps. We want explanations, we want certainty, we want things to fit. And when something refuses to fit, we become uncomfortable. That discomfort usually pushes people in one or two directions: absolute belief or total dismissal. And what if both positions are mistakes? Because belief without evidence becomes fantasy. Dismissal without curiosity. History is filled with examples of certainty being wrong. There was a time when meteorites were dismissed as impossible. Scientists openly mocked the idea that rocks could fall from the sky. The French Academy of Sciences once rejected reports entirely because, in their words, and I quote, "Stones cannot fall from the heavens because there are no stones in the heavens." Well, they were wrong, weren't they? For years, gorillas were considered a myth. European explorers described them as stories told by locals, unverified, exaggerated, impossible, until they weren't. Giant squid were treated as sailor folklore, an invention of exhausted minds at sea, until specimens were finally documented. Again, not because they suddenly appeared, but because human understanding caught up. That distinction matters because history repeatedly teaches the same lesson. Reality does not care what humans are ready to believe. And every now and again, something moves quietly at the edge of the understanding, until eventually we're forced to admit, yeah, we weren't seeing clearly. And maybe that's the question sitting underneath all of this. Not whether aliens exist, but whether humanity has a habit of dismissing difficult things until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Because in the next section, we need to talk about people making claims to so extraordinary that even believers struggle with them. Government insiders, recovery programs, whistleblowers, testimony that, if true, would completely change the shape of this story. But there's a problem, because claims are not evidence. And somewhere between those two things, this mystery becomes even harder to carry. If uncertainty is difficult to sit with, then what comes next becomes even harder, because eventually every mystery reaches the same point, the point where somebody steps forward and says something so extraordinary that people immediately split into two groups: the ones who believe it instantly and the ones who dismiss it immediately. Very rare. Very rarely does anyone stay in the uncomfortable middle, but the middle is where the story lives. Because in 2023, the conversation surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena shifted again. And this time, it didn't come from blurry footage or distant lights in the sky. It came from inside the system. A man named David Grush. Now, we need to be precise here, because precision matters. David Grush is not some anonymous internet source. He is a former US Air Force intelligence officer, a veteran, shall we say. someone who worked with the National Reconnaissance Office, the agency responsible for some of the United States' most classified satellite intelligence. Need a drink. He also served with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and importantly, he held security clearances high enough to access highly sensitive information. That does not make him automatically correct, but it does make him difficult to casually dismiss, because when somebody with that background makes extraordinary claims, you do pay attention, like, even if only to understand why they're saying them. In 2023, Grush testified publicly before Congress under oath, and what he alleged was staggering. He claimed that the United States government and potentially private defense contractors had been involved in a long-running program to recover and reverse engineer craft of non-human origin. Now read that sentence again mentally, because whether you believe him or not, this is not a small claim. This is civilization changing, history changing, reality changing. And he didn't stop there. He alleged that biological material associated with recovered craft had also been retrieved. Now, stop there, because this is exactly where things become difficult. This is where most people immediately make a decision, believe everything or reject everything, but neither reaction is useful, because here's what we actually know. David Grush testified under oath. That is fact. He provided information to Inspector Generals. Fact. Several lawmakers publicly stated that some of his classified claims appeared credible enough to investigate further. Also fact. But, and this part matters enormously, Grush has not publicly presented physical evidence. He has not shown recovered material. He has not provided photographs, documents, or different proof available for independent public verification. His claims remain claims. Extraordinary ones, but claims. And yet, that still leaves us with a problem. Because if this were simply a random person making extraordinary allegations, it would be easy to move on, but it's not. And that's what makes it, like, uncomfortable in a way. Because people inside the intelligence community took him seriously enough to listen seriously enough to investigate seriously enough to bring the discussion into congressional hearings. Obviously creates tension, because either he is profoundly mistaken and misled, fed misinformation, or something deeply unusual exists inside systems most people never see. Neither explanation feels comfortable. And maybe that's the point, really, because comfort has never really belonged to this story. What makes this guy especially interesting is not simply what he claimed, but what his testimony did to the wider conversation. It reopened a question many people had quietly stopped asking. Not, are aliens real, but how much do we know about them? Because uncertainty feels different when it comes from people close to classified systems. It carries a little bit more weight, you know, even if it carries doubt at the same time. And then something else began happening. Patterns started appearing. Again, the same descriptions, behaviours, repeated across decades, across pilots, countries, technologies, no visible propulsion, sudden acceleration, objects appearing capable of hovering without lift, movement against prevailing wind conditions, the ability to transition between environments, air, sea, sometimes both. What military investigators sometimes refer to as transmedium movement. And if that phrase sounds strange, that's because it is. Because conventional aircraft don't behave like that. Submarines don't behave like an aircraft. An aircraft don't behave like submarines. Physics creates limits, or at least we assume it does. And yet, here we are again, standing in front of reports that refuse to disappear. Take Commander David Fravor. His account has remained remarkably consistent over time. No embellishment or dramatic reinvention. The same details again and again and again. The object, the ocean disturbance, the acceleration, the impossible movement. Ryan Graves described repeated encounters during training missions. Routine sightings, not one dramatic event. Patterns. Pilots discussing objects they couldn't explain. Sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. And then you begin noticing something unsettling. The consistency. Because consistency is important. People separated by geography, culture, years, even decades, describing remarkably similar things. And human beings are complicated. Memory changes, stories evolve, people exaggerate, that happens. But consistency across independent observations, now that deserves attention, and it's certainly got mine. And here's where things become psychologically uncomfortable, because at some point, you're forced into a position you may not want to occupy. Either thousands of trained observers, radar operators, military personnel, pilots are repeatedly making highly similar mistakes across generations in remarkably consistent ways, or something genuinely unusual has been interacting with human systems for much longer than we're comfortable admitting. Notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying extraterrestrial. I'm not saying alien. I'm not saying unusual. Because strange things do exist. Reality is full of them. And history repeatedly humbles certainty. There was a time when people mocked the idea of invisible waves carrying voices through the air. Then came radio. The idea that humans could split the atom sounded absurd until it happened. Entire revolutions in understanding often begin the same way. Quietly dismissed, misunderstood, until eventually reality kicks in and they can't argue with it. Now, to be absolutely clear, this does not mean Grush is right. It does not confirm hidden programs. It does not prove recovered craft. But it does something else, something similar, something smaller, and somehow more unsettling. It forces open a possibility, and possibilities have consequences. Because once you stop dismissing a question entirely, it changes shape. It becomes harder to ignore, harder to laugh off, harder to put back into the box marked fiction, and maybe that's why this conversation feels different now. Because something has shifted. Not proof, not certainty, just pressure. The pressure of unanswered questions, the pressure of repeated patterns, the pressure of people trained to recognize these threats, admitting that sometimes they don't know what they're looking at.